Since this withdrawal into itself, or self-centeredness of the existent consciousness, immediately makes itself discordant, evil appears as the primary existence of the inwardly turned consciousness. And because the thoughts of good and evil are utterly opposed, and this antithesis is not yet resolved, this consciousness is essentially only evil. But at the same time, on account of just this antithesis, there is also present the good consciousness opposing it and their relations to each other. Insofar as an immediate existence suddenly changes into thought, and the being within self is on the one hand a thinking, while on the other hand the moment of the othering of essence is more precisely determined by it, because of this double aspect, the becoming of evil can be shifted further back out of the existent world, even into the primary realm of thought. It can therefore be said that it is the very firstborn son of light, Lucifer himself, who fell because he withdrew into himself or became self-centered, but that in his place another was at once created. Such a form of expression is fallen, which, like the expression son, belongs moreover to picture thinking and not to the notion, degrades the moments of the notion to the level of the picture thinking, or carries picture thinking over into the realm of thought. Likewise, it makes no difference if we coordinate a multiplicity of other shapes with the simple thought of otherness in the eternal being and transfer the self-centeredness into them. In fact, this coordination must be approved, since by means of it, this moment of otherness also expresses diversity as it should, and moreover, not as plurality in general, but also as a specific diversity, so that the one part, the son, is that which is simple and knows itself to be essential being, while the other part is the alienation, the externalization of being for self, which lives only to praise that being. To this part, then, can be assigned the taking back again of the externalized being for self and the withdrawal into self of the evil principle. Insofar as the otherness falls into two parts, spirit might, as regards its moments, if these are to be counted, be more exactly expressed as a quaternity in unity, or because the quantity itself again falls into two parts, that is, one part which has remained good and the other which has become evil, might even be expressed as a 5-in-1. But to count the moments can be reckoned as altogether useless, since in the first place what can be differentiated is itself just as much only one thing, that is, the thought of the difference, which is only one thought, as it, the differentiated, is this differentiated element, the second relatively to the first. And secondly, it is useless to count because the thought which grasps the many in a one must be dissolved out of its universality and differentiated into more than 3 or 4 distinct components. And this universality appears in contrast to the absolute determinateness of the abstract unit, the principle of number, as indeterminateness with respect to number as such, so that we could speak only of numbers in general, that is, not of a specific number of differences. Here, therefore, it is quite superfluous to think of numbers and counting at all, just as in other respects the mere difference of quantity and amount has no notional significance and makes no difference. Paragraph 776, there's a lot going on in this long paragraph. If we wanted to be a little facetious, we could say that there's a lot of moving parts. And why do I say that would be facetious? Because we see Hegel talking about this, possible quaternity or 5 in unity with its different parts. And they can't be just parts is portion of the little joke that we're making here, which probably isn't all that funny, but it's about as good as you're going to get out of Hegel's stuff. So a lot happening here on the heels of the previous paragraphs. There is a bit of what kind of feels like a digression. We'll see why it's not exactly a digression if we read between the lines about the point that's been made over and over again about picture thinking and notional thinking, Vorstellen, representation, or picture thinking, and then the concept or notion, the Begriff, right? And, conceptual thinking. And there's, that's going to be important as it's going to turn out, but in a different way. And I think it's good that he's making the examples that he is. We've seen previous examples of talking about Father and Son and the Garden of Eden, human beings screwing things up. These are all examples of picture thinking. So we'll talk about that in a moment because we get some new bits of picture thinking here, right? We have Lucifer, the very firstborn son of light. But let's get there first. So this paragraph begins by talking about, here in the translation, since this withdrawal into itself or self-centeredness of the existent consciousness immediately makes itself discordant. And, the key term there is actually withdrawal into self. In sich gehen. This is interesting, because a little bit later in the passage, we're going to have in sich sein, not an sich sein, which we've seen over and over again. Being in itself, or intrinsic being is sometimes how it gets translated. This is different. An and in are not exactly the same. This is an interiority that we're talking about here. A withdrawal into itself, in sich gehen, that makes sense. Gehen, to go, right? To go into its own self. And self-centeredness is just adding some extra stuff to this. Of the existent consciousness, the Dasein des Bewusstsein, which is what we're going to begin with here. But before that, I think it's good to point out this really rich term that Hegel's using here, self-discordant. It as he says here, makes it self-discordant. Okay, so there is a transformation that's taking place. Sich selbst, right? Two intensifiers, self, you could say. Ungleich. We'll come back to that in a moment. And then werden, rather than sein, werden, becoming, the transformation of itself into something that is, okay, so discordant, ungleich, does that work? Yes. Unequal as well. Not corresponding to each other. And this is going to be really important. Hold on to that, because when we get to this multiplicity of shapes, and also when we're thinking about good and evil, this ungleich is not simply like a equal sign with the slash through it. They're just not the same thing. And discordant kind of captures it. We need to think about what discordance really is in order to draw all the meaning out of this. When we have a discord in music, when you're listening to a chord and then it gets transformed a little bit, some of the notes get, raised or lowered or maybe warped, right? And you're like, oh, that doesn't sound so great. Dissonance is often how we talk about it. Something, a greater unity, but also an organization has been lost or bent or broken or abandoned. Now, of course, you could say, well, wait a second. In the history of music, we have all sorts of cases where what was originally discordant to us in the present sounds really cool. Yes, that's true, but it's because we're responding to having worked through that sound. At first, it was like, oh, that's awful. Don't do that, right? So let's go on with this. We start, as he says, with evil. Evil appears as the primary existence, erste, right? First existence, the first Dasein of the inwardly turned consciousness. Okay, so how is evil appearing as existence? It is realizing, this is consciousness, it is self-consciousness too. It is realizing itself, the existent consciousness, within this antithesis that now is available to it of the good versus the evil that we saw brought in the last paragraph. It's left the realm of innocence. And he says, because the thoughts of good and evil are utterly opposed. I mean, utterly opposed is a little bit of a hyperbole there. They're entgegengesetzt, right? They're opposed to each other, and there's an Entgegensetzung, a opposition, or if you like, antithesis being involved here. Not quite as, strong as a Gegensatz, a contradiction, right? But they're opposed, and because this antithesis is not yet resolved. Now, notice this is a really interesting part. This consciousness is essentially only evil. But at the same time, because of this antithesis, there is also present the good consciousness opposing it and their relation of antithesis to each other. Okay, we got to pause here because there's a lot happening in this spot. It has to do with this self-discordant becoming. So let's take up the easiest part first, right? If there's a consciousness that is conscious of itself as evil, in being conscious of that, it is conscious of another consciousness, which is also perhaps a possibility for itself, a good consciousness, that it is not, right? There's an othering going on here, and this fits in perfectly with, what we know about self-consciousness from a Hegelian perspective, that self-consciousness is self-consciousness in relation to another self-consciousness, and in this case, one is good, one is evil. The one that I am at this point is evil, and the other one is good. And maybe I have some inkling what that means. Maybe I understand it as just not being me, right? The good one doesn't necessarily here at this point understand the evil consciousness. Maybe that's just kind of an absurdity or foolishness to it. But the evil can understand the good and its relation, as Hegel says, its Beziehung to it. So there's, you could say, epistemologically, a primacy of the evil consciousness. And why is this evil consciousness evil? To go a little bit ahead and to say something about Hegel and good and evil in general, Hegelian ethics is, very much about recognition. That's a key idea there. But another key thing is being part of a vast system in which you have your legitimate place and you do your legitimate tasks, and you have the truth of your existence as part of the truth of the whole, rather than you exploiting the whole or parts of the whole or taking advantage of it or reacting against it, setting yourself apart. That's part of what's evil. And this is something that the Hegelians, going all the way into the 20th century British Hegelians, will stress as part of the Hegel idealist ethics, point of view. So to become aware of yourself as an existent individual, and as we've seen earlier in the morality section, as an individual with your own interpretations of things, as an individual motivated by your own desires who, gets the categorical imperative or the rules that you're supposed to follow, and you're like, well, why the hell should I do this? Well, that makes you evil, right? At least in this sense. And so evil is becoming kind of part of what it is to to exist. So essentially, only evil is the phrase that he uses here. So we have at the same time, the good consciousness, and then Hegel takes us in a different direction. So far, we've been thinking about the human being, right? The human being becomes aware of themselves as evil. Okay, we look at the previous paragraph, Garden of Eden, we left it. We have knowledge of good and evil, but God is good, at least, right? Well, maybe there's some evil in God too, or in the divine and the eternal, at least. So he says, insofar as immediate existence, the existent consciousness, right, suddenly changes into thought and the being within self, and this, again, is in sich sein, right? Not an sich sein. The being within self is on the one hand a thinking, while on the other hand, the moment of the othering of essence is more precisely determined by it, right? So we've got what's going on in what's going to be called the realm of thought in just a moment. We have being within self as part of that, in sich sein. And we have othering, Andersein, of essence, of Wesen. Those are both sides to what's happening in the thought. So he goes on and he says, because of this double aspect, that's Miller's gloss, the becoming of evil, that's a very interesting term, isn't it? Especially since, where is Werden showing up before this? Sich selbst ungleich werden, right? The withdrawal into itself is a becoming self-discordant. Now we have the becoming of evil, böse werden, right? The development, the entrance into the world of evil, maybe flourishing, the unpacking of this thing that we're viewing as evil, that is viewing itself as evil, but now shifting away from the individual existent consciousness into something more universal, something more abstract, perhaps even the eternal, that is the divine. So he goes on and he says, the becoming of evil can be shifted further back out of the existent world, right? In the previous paragraphs, we got world, we got individual human self, we got God up there, right? And so now we're shifting out of that up into the realm of thought, the Reich der Denkens. And what are we going to have here? Now, here's where he starts to talk about some picture thinking ideas. And so, what are these? He says, it can therefore be said that it is the very firstborn son of light, gloss here, Lucifer, himself who fell. Why? He withdrew into himself or became self-centered. He did an in sich gehen, right? And by doing so, became discordant. And how exactly did that take place? Well, there's different origin stories of the devil, right? It could, think about St. Anselm. He's got a whole book called On the Fall of the Devil, and it's him and one of his best students sort of, going back and forth and trying to figure this thing out. And, in the end, they're like, well, isn't God on the hook for this? Because he made the devil the way he is. And they reason to the point that where it's like, no, the devil chose something that wasn't bad for him to choose per se, but he shouldn't have chosen at that time. That would be one sort of portrayal of the in sich gehen that Hegel is talking about here, namely to be like God, right? To have an autonomous will, propria voluntas, in Anselm. Coming back to Hegel, he says, in his place another was at once created. Who's that other? Well, the human beings, because it wasn't just Lucifer who fell, the other fallen angels and human beings will take their place. We're in the realm of all sorts of picture thinking, Vorgestalt, conjectures on the part of religious people, specifically within Christianity for the most part. I think you can find this outside as well, but a lot of Christian theology, particularly in the Middle Ages, was very interested in this topic of the good human beings replacing the fallen angels. Picture thinking from Hegel's perspective, right? And we can go on further. Such a form of expression as fallen, which, like the expression son, belongs to picture thinking and not to the notion. Okay, so here we have sort of a classificatory thing. Picture thinking, representation, not bad in and of itself. As a matter of fact, it can lead people towards the notion, which is where we want to go. But there can be a danger of remaining with it, right? Thinking that it's adequate. And so he says, what does this do? It degrades the moments of the notion to the level of picture thinking. keep that in mind when we get to the stuff that we're going to talk about in just a couple minutes. Or it carries picture thinking over into the realm of thought. Both of these are a problem, right? We have this sort of degradation or reduction of the notion which somebody's worked out to picture thinking, and picture thinking just can't support what the notion provides. Or we're bringing into the notion, we're bringing into the realm of thought, the higher realm of thought, the structures of picture thinking, which are, again, going to cause some problems. So he says, likewise, it makes no difference if we coordinate, right? And this is going to be quite important. Beiordnung is going to be the noun here. If we coordinate a multiplicity of other shapes, right? So Hegel's talking here about gestalten. Are we talking about gestalten in the full sense of like, okay, here's a stage of consciousness? No. But it's more than just forms or moments or something like that. And this is a Mannigfaltigkeit, right? And to go back to what I said in some of the previous paragraphs, we have to remember that when we're talking about God and human consciousness is not just a single individual consciousness. It is a whole bunch of individual consciousnesses living in a social world together, connected to each other in complex relations. It's not very simple. And so we've got a multiplicity, a Mannigfaltigkeit here. And the question is, well, what kind of multiplicity are we working with? So he says, makes no difference if we coordinate a multiplicity of other shapes with the simple thought of otherness in the eternal being, right? The othering of essence, and transfer the self-centeredness, the being within self, the in sich sein, into them. And then he says, in fact, this coordination must be approved, this Beiordnung, right? And it's not just an Ordnung, a ordering. Think of the by here as sort of an intensification. Sort of like the fair that often gets used in German to indicate that there's something interesting happening here. This coordination must be approved, since by means of this moment of otherness also expresses, and now we've got a couple different terms coming up. It expresses diversity, as it should, and moreover, notice this clarification, not as a plurality in general, but as a specific diversity. So we have two connected, ideas here, signified by different words. Vielheit is plurality. There being more than one, right? There being a many, viel, right? And a Mannigfaltigkeit is by its, very nature a Vielheit, isn't it? A manifold, a multiplicity, it has to be a plurality. But this is different. Verschiedenheit, right? A more coordinated, more selected, you could say, diversity. Not just like laying a bunch of cards on the table, but saying how the cards are connected to each other. So he goes on and he starts unpacking this, right? We have the sun, and what is the sun? That which is simple and knows itself to be the essential being. Okay, great. So we got a thing here, or an aspect. And on the other part is the alienation, the externalization of being for self, which lives only to praise that being. Cool, now we got two things, right? We got the sun and the alienation, sort of like we've got being within self, and we've got the othering of that essence. And in this case, the othering of that essence has its own kind of, agency. It's going to praise the sun. Cool, now we've got a duality. Here's where it gets really kind of weird, because Hegel's going to now break this second part down into two parts. And he says, here we go. To this part can be assigned the taking back of the externalized being for self. Okay? Taking back the externalized being for self is a part of this alienation or externalization. and also the withdrawal into self of the evil principle. So now we've got two things in the alienation side. Now, where is Hegel getting 4 from? It's as if he's reading these things as 4 when we really would say you've got 2 and part of the 2 is broken down into a further 2. That should amount to 3. And, that's right. But maybe that's there to suggest to us what Hegel's going to tell us about numbers in a bit. They don't matter. Don't get all worked up about numbers because you're losing the point there. Because look at the next thing that he says. Insofar as the otherness falls into 2 parts, spirit might, as regards its moments, if these are to be counted, be more exactly expressed as a quaternity and unity, or because the quantity, and quantity there is a translation of manga, the crowd, the lot, you could say. It's not an actual quantity. Itself falls into 2 parts. One part which has remained good and the other which has become evil. It might even be expressed as a 5 and 1. And now you could say, okay, we need to really spend a lot of time here figuring out exactly how these divisions and calculations take place. And if you want to do that, more power to you. You can also see this as Hegel is just kind of showing you what he's going to talk about in a minute, the futility, the pointlessness of doing precisely that. Because what does he say next? He tells us that to count the moments, zählen, right? Zählen means to number. Because immediately after this, Hegel is going to talk about numbers, Zahlen, right? So Zählen is to number things. And he tells us that counting is useless, unnütz. It's not helpful. It's a waste of our time. You might even say it's a distraction. Why? He says, to count the moments can be reckoned as altogether useless. Why? In the first place, what is differentiated is itself just as much only one thing. The thought of the difference, which is only one thought, as the differentiated, is this differentiated element, the second relatively to the first. So here Hegel is saying, listen, parse it up however you want. It's still a unity, and that's part of what matters here. So your numbering is numbering the same thing, right? Second, he says, it's useless to count because the thought which grasps the many in a one must be dissolved out of its universality and differentiated into more than 3 or 4 distinct components. Okay, so there's not enough? You got to go further with this? Yes, but we also need to get away from the abstract and towards the more particular relations that these aspects have with each other. So he says, this universality appears in contrast to the absolute determinateness of the abstract unit, the principle of number, Zahl, right? As indeterminateness with respect to number as such, so that we could speak only of numbers in general, not of a specific number of differences. Here, therefore, who's bringing this to a close, it is quite superfluous to think of numbers and counting at all, just as in other respects the mere difference of quantity and amount has no notional significance and makes no difference. So, what is Hegel saying here? Worrying about the numbers here, it's not as if numbers are bad or anything like that, but it's another kind of picture thinking. It doesn't use pictures, it uses numbers, it uses counting and stuff like that. But just because you're not using images doesn't mean that you're not doing Vorstellung, right? It's not adequate to the notion of the divine and of the human consciousness that is grasping the divine. So this is, I think, a really, really important little section of the phenomenology that, because it's quite complex and difficult, I think a lot of people would be tempted to read through quick and then be like, I'll come back to this and it'll make more sense later. And it will make more sense later as you read the next paragraphs. But this is one that we really, really need to linger over as we have just done.